All right, fellow skeptics, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're tackling Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you know that personal finance classic, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's either a roadmap to riches or just like a hilarious satire of the whole American dream, you know?
Right.
And, you guys tossed this one our way, so
Yeah.
let's see what we could do here. Let's see if we can separate the gold nuggets from,
Okay.
well, let's just say the more creative interpretations of wealth building out there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the things that's so fascinating about this source is the way it tackles the book's central idea.
Okay.
That whole contrasting mindsets of the rich dad versus the poor dad.
Right.
It's almost like a sitcom setup.
Right.
You've got the poor dad who has all the traditional markers of success,
Mm-hmm.
the good education, the steady job, and somehow ends up struggling financially.
Yeah.
And then you've got the rich dad who's all about thinking outside the box, embracing risk, and that's the one who's, living the high life.
It really makes you wonder
Yeah.
if maybe we've all been sold a bit of a fairy tale
Mm-hmm.
about what success really looks like.
Right.
I mean, how many people do you know who slaved away at school, landed that dream job, and they're still wondering, where their financial freedom went?
Totally. That's exactly the point I think the source is picking up on here.
Yeah.
It's not just about working hard.
Okay.
It's about understanding the rules of the game, right?
Yeah.
And maybe even bending them a little bit.
Yeah.
And Rich Dad, Poor Dad really hammers home this idea of acquiring assets, things that put money in your pocket.
Right.
But our source adds this hilarious layer of, let's call it creative interpretation to it.
Okay. This is where it gets juicy.
Right.
Lay it on me. What kind of creative interpretations are we talking about?
Well, remember how the book uses all these unconventional examples of assets and liabilities?
Mm-hmm.
Cars, even mistresses,
Okay.
and yes, even wives.
Wives as liabilities.
As potential liabilities, yeah.
Now, even for a book that's meant to be a bit provocative,
Right.
that's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah, and the source definitely picks up on that,
Okay.
highlighting how this kind of over-the-top example plays into the book's satirical tone.
Yeah.
It's almost as if they're saying, look, anything that requires constant financial output, no matter how much you might love it,
Yeah.
can be seen as a liability in the cold, hard world of finance.
Okay. I can see how that fits into the whole
Yeah.
challenging conventional wisdom
Yeah.
thing that the book is known for.
Yeah.
But it definitely feels like they're walking a tightrope there,
Yeah.
even for satire.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
It's definitely pushing the boundaries.
Okay.
But it also makes us stop and think,
Uh,
are there things in our own lives that we're clinging to, maybe out of tradition or emotion, that are actually holding us back financially?
that's a really good point. It's easy to get caught up in that, that whole keeping up with the Joneses mentality.
Exactly.
And forget that those shiny new toys might actually be dragging us down.
Totally.
Speaking of things that could be either assets or liabilities,
Yes.
let's talk about the book's love affair with real estate.
Oh, yeah.
It's all about those rental properties, right?
Right.
Tenants paying your mortgage, you're sipping lemonade on a beach somewhere.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty idyllic.
It does sound good, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
But our source is quick to point out that the reality of real estate investing isn't always so picture perfect.
Okay.
They bring up this really interesting example from China,
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of people have poured their savings into property,
Right?
only to find that market fluctuations and other factors can make those investments
Yeah.
a lot less lucrative than they had hoped.
Ah, so the easy money from real estate
Right.
isn't always so easy after all.
And not always.
Our source is definitely poking some holes in that whole rich dad
Yeah.
fantasy.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good reminder that no investment is foolproof.
Right?
And even something as seemingly stable as real estate
Yeah,
comes with its own set of risks.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've got these contrasting philosophies on wealth
Mm-hmm.
and a healthy dose of skepticism about some of those traditional paths to success.
Right.
But there's another big theme that runs through Rich Dad, Poor Dad,
Mm-hmm.
and it's one that our source really digs into.
Okay.
This idea that the wealthy play by a different set of rules
Yeah.
when it comes to taxes.
This is where the source gets really interesting and maybe even a little controversial.
Okay.
They highlight the book's claim that the wealthy often pay less in taxes than the average person.
Right.
Not because they're cheating the system,
Okay.
but because they understand how to use it to their advantage.
Yeah, the source actually drops this crazy statistic.
Oh.
The world's richest individuals,
Mm-hmm.
think Bezos and Gates, they're supposedly paying less than 1% in taxes
Yeah.
annually.
Yeah.
That's less than a lot of folks making minimum wage.
Right. And that's exactly the kind of information that would appeal to the source's target audience,
Right.
those who are already skeptical of the system,
Mm-hmm.
and how it seems to favor those at the top. It makes you wonder, is this just savvy financial planning?
Yeah.
Or is there something fundamentally unfair
Right.
about how the tax game is played?
It definitely raises some eyebrows,
Yeah.
especially when you think about how much emphasis the book places
Yeah.
on financial education,
Right.
and knowing the rules
Well,
as the key to wealth.
right.
Which kind of brings us to another big point
Yeah.
that the book makes.
Okay.
Traditional education might actually be holding us back from financial success.
Rich Dad Poor Dad argues that schools focus on preparing us for jobs, not for building wealth.
Right.
The source uses this really funny analogy,
Okay.
pointing out that there's no how to be a billionaire class
Uh-huh.
in most college catalogs.
Which, when you think about it,
I know, right?
kind of absurd.
Yeah.
We spend all this time learning how to be good employees,
Mm-hmm.
but very little time learning how to be, like, financially independent.
Right. It's
But-
like
but-
we're being trained to be cogs in the machine
Right.
instead of being taught how to build our own machines.
Yeah.
And this ties into the book's breakdown of the 4 categories of earners:
Okay.
employees, experts, business owners, and investors.
Okay, let's break those down. I think it's
Mhm.
important
Yeah.
for our listeners to understand
For sure.
the differences here. What sets each of these categories apart?
So employees are those who trade their time and skills for a paycheck.
Okay.
Experts are similar, but they often have specialized knowledge
Uh-huh.
that commands a higher price.
Got it.
Business owners, they create and manage their own ventures,
Right.
taking on more risk, but potentially reaping greater rewards.
Okay.
And then you have investors who use their capital to generate passive income
Right.
through various means,
Yeah.
like stocks, real estate, or other ventures.
So Rich Dad Poor Dad is basically saying,
Yeah.
if you want to be truly wealthy,
Uh-huh.
you need to move beyond being an employee
Right.
or even an expert and start thinking like a business owner or an investor.
Exactly. The source even highlights the book's somewhat cynical view
Okay.
that schools primarily train us to be employees and experts
Yeah.
who are essentially working for the business owners and investors.
Right.
It's almost like a class warfare argument,
Oh.
disguised as financial advice.
It's getting into some interesting territory.
Right.
It definitely makes you question whether the system is rigged
Yeah.
to keep certain people at the top,
Uh-huh.
while others are stuck in a cycle of working for someone else's profit.
It does, and it's this kind of thought-provoking, even slightly subversive approach
Yeah.
that makes both the book and the source so compelling,
Okay.
especially for those who are already questioning the status quo.
All right, so we've got these contrasting philosophies on wealth, the importance of understanding the rules of the game, this idea that maybe traditional education isn't setting us up for financial success.
Right.
But where do those 7 levels of investors
Oh, yeah.
that Rich Dad Poor Dad is so famous for,
Right.
where does that fit into all of this?
Well, those levels are really about illustrating the progression
Okay.
from being clueless about money
Yeah,
to becoming a master of the financial universe.
right.
And of course, our source couldn't resist having a little fun with those descriptions.
Oh, I bet. Especially with those don't bother me and gambler types.
Yeah.
They sound like characters straight out of a Wall Street comedy.
Exactly. The don't bother me investor is that person
Okay.
who thinks they've got it all figured out
Uh-huh.
and refuses to listen to advice, even if it's coming from someone with more experience.
And the gambler is the one
Yeah.
who's constantly chasing those risky, high-reward opportunities.
Right.
Probably based on a hot tip they heard at a cocktail party.
Exactly. They're more concerned with making a quick buck than with understanding the underlying fundamentals of investing.
It's amazing how the source manages to capture these personality types
Yeah.
with such humor and accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
But they also make a really important point
Okay.
about how moving beyond being a passive investor,
Right.
someone who just buys stocks or mutual funds and hopes for the best,
Right.
is crucial for creating substantial wealth.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Rich Dad Poor Dad emphasizes that to truly build wealth, you need to become an active player in the game,
Okay.
shaping markets and creating opportunities.
So it's not just about understanding the rules, it's
Mhm.
about having the courage and the know-how to rewrite them.
Precisely. And that brings us to what might be the most intriguing
Okay.
and perhaps even ironic aspect of this whole discussion.
Okay.
The idea that many people are drawn to investing because it seems easier than building a business.
Hold on, easier.
Yeah.
That's not what I've heard.
I know, right?
Isn't investing supposed to be this complex, high-stakes world where you need an MBA and a team of analysts just to break even?
Well, the source picks up on this common misconception and challenges it head-on.
Okay.
They point out that investing, especially if you're aiming for those higher levels of wealth creation,
Right.
actually requires a different and perhaps even more demanding set of skills than running a traditional business.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break this down for me.
Okay.
Why would investing be more challenging than, say, opening a bakery or starting a consulting firm?
Think of it this way. With a business, you're creating something tangible, something you can see and touch and directly control. But with investing, you're dealing with abstract concepts, like market trends, economic indicators, and the often unpredictable behavior of other investors.
So it's more about navigating a system
that
you can't fully control.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty daunting.
It can be. And the source uses this brilliant analogy to drive home the point. They compare investing to being handed the keys to a powerful car without knowing how to drive. You have the potential to go far, but without the proper skills and knowledge, you're more likely to crash and burn than to reach your destination.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
Right.
Suddenly that whole passive income dream feels a lot less passive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it sets the stage for a deeper exploration of the investment paradox. Is investing truly a path to easy riches? Or does it require a different and perhaps even more challenging form of hard work?
That's a question I think a lot of people, myself included, would love an answer to.
Right.
But for now, we'll have to leave our listener hanging on that cliffhanger.
All right.
We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
Yeah, for sure.
From contrasting philosophies on wealth to the allure and potential pitfalls of investing.
Right.
Welcome back, fellow deep divers. We're picking up our exploration of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And more importantly, this insightful source, that's adding a layer of, shall we say, reality to the book's sometimes larger-than-life claims.
Right.
Last time we left off with this really intriguing question. Is investing really the shortcut to easy street that it's often made out to be?
And our source seems to be hinting that the answer is a resounding not so fast. They're not saying that investing is a bad idea, but they are challenging this notion that it's a simple, effortless way to get rich. In fact, they argue that it can be even more challenging than running a traditional business, which, let's face it, is no walk in the park either.
That's fascinating because I think a lot of people, myself included, have this image of investing as something you do once you've made it, You've got your business running smoothly, you're pulling in a comfortable income, and then you dabble in the stock market. Or you buy a rental property as a way to passively grow your wealth.
And the source is really poking holes in that romanticized view of investing. They point out that successful investing requires a very specific set of skills, and those skills aren't always the same ones that make you a successful entrepreneur or a business owner. You need to understand market cycles, economic indicators, and you have to be comfortable with a certain level of risk.
So it's not just about having money to invest. It's about knowing how to invest it wisely.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see why the source compares it to being handed the keys to a Lamborghini without knowing how to drive. You might have a powerful machine at your disposal, but without the right skills, you're more likely to end up in a ditch than cruising down the coast. And I love how they connect this back to the book's emphasis on financial education. Rich Dad, Poor Dad makes this big deal about learning the rules of the game. So the source suggests that even with all the knowledge in the world, there's still an element of, well, let's call it luck, involved in investing.
For sure.
So even if you've read every book, attended every seminar, and can recite Warren Buffett's investment strategies in your sleep, there's no guarantee you'll come out on top.
Exactly. There are just too many factors. outside of our control.
Right.
Market crashes, unexpected economic downturns.
Yeah.
Even just plain bad timing, that can impact our investment outcomes.
Right.
And this is where the source's satirical take really shines through.
Okay.
It's like they're saying, hey, take all this financial advice with a grain of salt, folks.
Yeah.
Even the experts don't always get it right.
It's a good reminder to stay humble.
Yeah.
Even when we think we've got it all figured out.
Right.
Speaking of humility, let's revisit those 7 levels of investors that we touched on earlier. The source has some pretty hilarious insights into the personalities and motivations behind each level. And I think it speaks to the absurdity of the whole wealth-building game.
Oh, absolutely. Those investor types are like a caricature of the different ways people approach money and investing.
Right.
You've got the don't bother me investor who's convinced they know everything and refuses to listen to advice, even when it's coming from someone with more experience.
Right. And then there's the gambler who's constantly chasing those high-risk, high-reward opportunities, treating the stock market like a casino.
Exactly.
And let's not forget the saver.
Oh, yeah.
Who's so risk-averse that they'd rather stash their money under a mattress than invested in anything that might yield a return.
Right. They're the ones who miss out on potential growth opportunities because they're too afraid of losing what they've already got.
Yeah. It's almost like they're playing not to lose rather than playing to win.
Exactly.
And what's fascinating is that the source points out that even those who reach the higher levels of investing, the sophisticated investor and the capitalist, still make mistakes.
They do.
And experience setbacks.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that wealth creation isn't a linear path. It's a journey with ups and downs, twists and turns, and maybe even a few detours along the way.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from this whole discussion.
Right.
There's no magic formula for success. No guaranteed path to riches. It's about continuous learning. Adapting to changing circumstances. And maybe even being a little bit lucky along the way.
So it's not just about reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad and suddenly transforming into a financial wizard. There's more to it than that.
Well, the source seems to be suggesting that the book, while offering some valuable insights, might also be perpetuating a few myths about wealth creation. They're not saying that the book is entirely wrong, but they are highlighting the nuances and complexities that it sometimes glosses over.
It's like they're adding a layer of critical analysis to the conversation, encouraging us to think for ourselves and not just blindly accept what we're being told, even if it's coming from a so-called expert.
And they do it with a healthy dose of humor and irony. Which, let's face it, makes learning about finance a lot more enjoyable.
Because, let's be honest, add a little bit of humor. The world of finance can be pretty dry and intimidating.
It can. And the source recognizes that they're not afraid to poke fun at the absurdities of the system. The over-the-top personalities, the sometimes outlandish claims made by those who promise to hold the keys to financial freedom.
Okay, so we've talked about the complexities of investing, the different types of investors, and the importance of not taking everything we hear at face value. But there's another aspect of the source material that I want to delve into. This idea that our perceptions of money and wealth are shaped by societal norms and cultural values.
Absolutely. They even touch upon the concept of face.
Oh, interesting.
Which is particularly relevant in Asian cultures, where maintaining a certain social image and status is highly valued. They argue that this cultural emphasis on face can sometimes lead to financial decisions that are driven more by appearances than by sound financial principles.
That's really intriguing. It's like they're saying that cultural pressures can sometimes lead us to make financial choices that aren't necessarily in our best interests. Maybe we buy that fancy car or that oversized house. Not because we need it, but because we feel like we have to in order to maintain a certain social standing.
And the source also brings up how these cultural influences can show up in subtle ways, like our attitudes towards debt or our willingness to take financial risks. What might be considered normal or even responsible in one culture could be seen as reckless or irresponsible in another.
So it's not just about understanding the mechanics of money.
Right.
It's also about recognizing the cultural baggage that we bring to the table.
Exactly. And it's about being aware of how those cultural influences might be shaping our financial decisions, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
Okay, so we've added another layer of complexity
We have.
to our already multifaceted understanding of personal finance.
It is multifaceted, isn't it?
But I think this is where the source's satirical approach is so valuable.
Yeah.
By using humor and irony.
They're able to highlight these sensitive issues without being preachy or judgmental.
Exactly. It's like they're inviting us to laugh at ourselves, to recognize our own foibles and contradictions when it comes to money. And in doing so, they're creating space for a more honest and open conversation about these often taboo topics.
It's about taking finance seriously, but not taking ourselves too seriously.
Exactly. And that's a message I think we can all get behind.
All right, fellow financial adventurers, we've reached the final leg of our deep dive into Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
We have.
And this insightful source that's been our guide through the jungle of wealth-building wisdom, myths, and maybe even a few outright jokes.
A few joke for
through it all. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me has been this idea that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to financial success.
Right.
Rich Dad, Poor Dad might offer a roadmap. But our source reminds us that the terrain is constantly changing.
We need to be prepared to adapt, improvise, and maybe even forge our own paths.
Absolutely. The source really challenges this notion that there's some secret formula for getting rich. You know, some set of rules that, if followed precisely, will guarantee a life of luxury. They're highlighting the importance of critical thinking, of questioning assumptions, and of recognizing that even the most successful investors make mistakes, experience setbacks, and sometimes just get plain lucky.
It's like they're saying, hey, take all this financial advice with a grain of salt, folks. There's no magic bullet, no guaranteed path to riches. It's about finding what works for you, your circumstances, and your values.
And I think that's a really empowering message.
It is.
Because it means that we're not beholden to some predetermined definition of success. We get to define what financial freedom means for us. And we get to choose our own path to get there.
So instead of blindly following someone else's roadmap, we need to create our own.
I think so.
I'm starting to see why the source refers to Rich Dad, Poor Dad as a satire. It's like they're using humor and irony to expose the flaws in our thinking about wealth and success, and then challenging us to find a more authentic and personalized approach.
Exactly. And that's where the source's emphasis on continuous learning comes in. They're not just saying, read this book, follow these steps, and you'll be rich. They're encouraging us to become lifelong learners, to stay curious, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to always be on the lookout for new opportunities.
It's like they're saying, don't just be a consumer of financial advice. Be a critical thinker, a question asker, an active participant in shaping your own financial destiny.
And I love how they tie this back to the book's discussion of the 4 categories of earners, employees, experts, business owners, and investors. The source seems to be suggesting that true wealth creation often involves transcending those categories, finding ways to blend your skills, your interests, and your income streams to create a unique and fulfilling path to financial freedom.
So it's not just about picking a lane and sticking with it. It's about being adaptable, creative, and maybe even a little bit unconventional in our approach.
Absolutely. It's about finding that sweet spot where your passions, your skills, and the market's needs intersect. And it's about being open to opportunities that might not fit neatly into those traditional categories.
It's like they're saying, don't be afraid to break the mold. To challenge the status quo and to create your own definition of success.
And I think that's a really powerful message, especially for those of us who are skeptical of authority, traditional narratives, and the idea that there's only one right way to do things.
Because, let's face it, the world of finance can be pretty intimidating.
It can be.
Especially if you're coming from a place of limited financial literacy. But the source reminds us that it doesn't have to be that way. We can approach finance with a sense of humor, a healthy dose of skepticism, and a willingness to learn and adapt.
Exactly. And maybe along the way, we'll discover that the journey to financial freedom is just as rewarding as the destination itself.
So for those of you listening who are still wondering what unconventional path might lead you to financial freedom, the answer might be simpler than you think.
Okay.
Start by questioning everything.
Right.
Embrace the absurdity and never stop learning.
I love it.
That's a fantastic note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
It's been fun.
And the sometimes hilarious, sometimes perplexing.
It has been.
But always fascinating world of personal finance.
For sure.
Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and keep diving deep.